So I guess the moral of that story is don't trust technology. But hello there, and thank you very much for having me here today. And this is my first conference, so I'm extremely honored to be invited here to talk to you all today. So my name is Christopher Downer, and I'm a user interface designer from the UK. And as Chris told you, I work for a company called Bohemian Coding, where I design a Mac app called Sketch, which I'm sure some of you know. But if you don't, you should check it out. It's pretty cool. And there's a link there for you, bohemiancoding.com/sketch. But I've designed a few Mac and iOS apps over the past 5 or 6 years, probably most notably an app called Clear, which is a to-do list for the iPhone, which used quite a lot of gestures. But more importantly, what is this talk about? Well, the title is Designing Custom Interfaces. But why custom interfaces? Well, there have always been an increasing trend of apps with custom UIs appearing on the App Store. But whilst some apps may not be completely custom, it's likely that some parts will be. So I've come up with a few topics that I want to talk to you about today. And here they are. I think these are important aspects of iOS design, and there's certainly more of a focus on these topics since iOS 7 was released, especially considering the amount of third-party apps with custom interfaces. But hopefully there's at least something that you'll be able to take away from today. But before I begin, I'd just like to find out who we have in our audience. So if you are a developer, which I'm sure many of you will be, could you please put your hands up? OK. Do we have any designers in here? Could you put your hands up if you are? OK, so probably about 2. Great. Well, thank you for that. Let's move on to the first topic. So, as I mentioned, it seems that every app you see or read about on Twitter or tech articles, they seem to have super custom interfaces. And Facebook Paper is one of the more recent ones. It's almost completely custom. And I'm not sure about the developers here today, but if I gave this mock-up to some of the developers that I know, they'd probably really want to hurt me. But there's no other app quite like it. And let's take a look at another example, which is Wake, a simple alarm clock from a company called Tiny Hearts. It's an app that has no visible buttons. You either pull down or swipe across to interact with it. And to change your alarm, you tap and run your finger around the outside of that ring there like an old rotary phone. But this doesn't really look like an app that belongs on an iOS device, maybe something you would see in Minority Report or some kind of movie like that. But there are varying degrees of custom UI that you can use in your applications. And here are 3 examples of some common visual options you can go for. So of course, there's native, custom, and something that I like to call custom native. Native kind of explains itself. You could design this next code quite easily. There's a table view, a toolbar, navbar, all default elements, not much else to it. And the egg timer is custom, just like Paper and Wake, but it's been designed to fit in with iOS 7, so it doesn't feel completely alien. And you can see this with the status bar and the familiar outlined icons along the top. And Tweetbot here on the right is an example of an app that I would call custom native. It looks like an iOS 7 app. It's got all the usual characteristics, and it uses custom views and other custom UI elements, such as the tab bar, which runs along the bottom there. But this app is also quite cool because the entire UI changes color depending on the time of day. And those examples fall in line with these 4 points. If you're wanting to design a custom native UI, don't just mimic the default interface. The makers of Tweetbot have been inspired by Apple's designs, but they don't copy them. because if they did that, it would just feel like another stock application. And the Egg Timer app shows that it's still OK to use realism. We don't need green felt backgrounds and leather toolbars anymore. But the main reason to use this app over the built-in timer is because it's more fun. Less UI and more content is a rule that everybody should follow. If a user is reading an email, they don't want to see bars and buttons, just the thing that matters to them, their content. Consider making room for more text and allow images to reach the edges of the screen. And one of my favorite design mantras is related to this: if in doubt, leave it out. If you're not sure about adding something to an app, it probably doesn't need to be there. And finally, follow Apple's human interface guidelines with an asterisk. These are important to know, but they are just guidelines, not rules or laws that you have to adhere to. And here's a shortened link for Apple's guidelines for those of you who don't know. I think they actually released it as an iBook last night, so you can check out the iBook store there. I'll give you a chance to copy that down, but I think it's something that's it's a great resource for both developers and designers. As with any interface, a custom UI isn't just down to how it looks. It's how it works, how you use it. And going custom is a great opportunity to utilize various gestures and animations in your app. Well, let's talk a little bit about gestures first. Gestures are something that I think are hard to get right. Any app can have gestures, but it doesn't always work out. Well, let's take a look at how to get the best out of them. Use direct manipulation. I'm sure many of you have downloaded an app or a game from the App Store that uses gestures such as swiping, but they don't feel quite right. You go to interact with an element on the screen, and it doesn't follow your finger. It feels really cheap, and you're left thinking that you haven't interacted with it properly. And this is because nearly all users have come to expect direct manipulation when using apps on iOS. They feel more engaged, and it's easier for them to understand the results of their actions. It gives the user immediate feedback, much like having a press state on a button. Use gestures that feel natural. And with iOS, there's a number of gestures that are used within the system. Swiping to unlock your device, pinching to view photos in greater detail. And those are just a couple of examples of gestures people know and use loads of times a day. But whilst gestures in apps can be used to wow some users, you've got to make sure they're discoverable. For example, you may decide to have a two-finger swipe gesture, like scrolling on a trackpad on a Mac, in your app to reveal some content. And this is OK if you're going to reveal an Easter egg, but this isn't something that users would know about. There aren't any default apps that teach them this behavior. And because such a gesture is uncommon, users might just forget about it. Then they may get frustrated when they can't work out how to use your app. But this isn't to say you can't be different and try something new, but just be aware of the pitfalls. Related to that, you need to make sure users can use your app with one hand. They may be unable to use both hands when they use your app, or if you even think about it from an accessibility point of view, they may only have one arm or hand available to use. And you mustn't punish these users because you need to consider all possibilities when thinking about interaction, such as considering the opposites. So if someone uses one gesture to enter a view, such as a swipe from right to left, let them exit it by swiping the opposite direction, left to right. It sounds obvious, but I've used a lot of apps where I find I can't dismiss something or exit a particular view because it's a different interaction method from how I got there in the first place. It's something that I'll try instinctively to return because it's what I expect as a user, and when I can't do it, I get frustrated. It goes completely against the mental model that's been provided. And try not to rely on gestures too much. But this is something that really depends on the type of app you're building. If you're wanting to design something a little less custom, try and think of gestures like shortcuts. In a table view, in iOS, you can swipe a cell right to left to show the red delete button. And this may be hidden for a typical user. Some people might not know about this. But they can still reveal this delete option by tapping Edit, then the red disclosure button. But as the old adage goes, there's more than one way to skin a cat. For animations, I'm going to talk about these points a bit more briefly. The types of animation you can use are endless, and they can tie in really nicely with the gestures you may decide to use. They enhance the idea of direct manipulation, communicate feedback, and provide context. But first of all, don't be gratuitous. Don't use the same type of animations I just used in that last slide. But try and use tasteful animation that serves a purpose and doesn't distract users. Ask yourself, does it really need to be in there? Animations can look impressive, but it can be easily overused. Don't disorient your user. Animations and segues, which are full-screen transitions, can be used to reinforce hierarchy in an application. And this can show the user with no further explanation where this screen or element comes from and where it goes. And this can be particularly valuable if you choose to have a custom or a non-traditional view hierarchy. Use animations as feedback. Feedback aids a user's understanding. And these can be simple things, such as loading bars and spinners. Use them as cues that just wouldn't be possible with static images. Use animations to delight users. Animation makes things fun, and as long as they're tasteful, you can get away with them. And take cues from realism. With your interface, try and think about how it would behave if it were a physical object, if you plan on animating it. But don't try and defy the laws of physics, as you can easily break your user's mental model. Perfect animation speeds. If they're too slow, users will think your app is laggy. If a view were to appear on a screen with, say, an animation speed of just 1 second. But if you contrast that with the speed of 1/10 of a second, your content would appear, bam, right out of nowhere. It's just too quick and a little jarring, so you've got to experiment with speeds until you get what you feel is right. And play around with some of the more advanced concepts, such as easing in and out as well. And last of all, sounds. I wanted to mention how cool sounds were somewhere in this presentation, but I felt like this was the right slide to do it. You can pair sounds with animations quite nicely, and most of the same rules as above apply here as well. Well, I think sounds are best used when you're giving a user feedback. If they get an error or a notification for something positive, use the appropriate sound. Just make sure you have an option to allow users to disable them, because they can be really annoying if you're trying to listen to music and they're going off. Moving on now to designing first runs, the very first thing a user will see after they have downloaded your app. And as with everything, first impressions are important. Say you've downloaded an app from the App Store, the icon appears on your home screen, you go to open it, and what's the first thing that you see? Your app would like to send you push notifications. Notifications may include alerts, sounds, and icon badges. These can be configured in settings. And this is not okay. I don't know why this app wants to send me these alerts. Is it going to spam me? Can I see what it does first? But if I don't know what I'm agreeing to, I'm going to press don't allow, and I'm probably not going to go into Notification Center to turn them back on. Most users won't even know that they can do that. But because I press don't allow, I'm probably not going to get the real deal if notifications are a vital part of its experience. So if not here, when should you show this type of alert to request access to your contacts or to pick up your location? Ideally, it would be as a result of an action. People, not the app, should initiate when these alerts appear. In this way, the user will really understand why the app they are using wants to access certain permissions. For example, if you have an app that uses reminders, you may want push notifications. That's a great feature. But instead of bombarding the user for an answer as soon as they launch the app, let them create the reminder first before you ask them. What's about another common thing users may see when they launch your app for the first time? Well, a trend that's come around now are these welcome tutorials. And this is taken from the first run of an earlier version of Clear when I was working on it about 2 years ago. And I've seen a lot of similar things in other apps since then, particularly those which use custom interfaces and rely quite heavily on gestures. But with this, we discovered that a lot of our users just weren't reading them, and we spent a lot of time designing these cards. We debated over the exact wording of each card and gave them beautiful illustrations showing off all the gestures. But as it turned out, for a lot of users, the first run looked like this. They were so keen and eager to use the app, they just swiped all the cards out of the way. And not everybody did this, but we could tell who did. And those were the users who emailed us asking one of two things, either asking, how do I enable iCloud, or how do I use this app? Well, to answer that first question, let's just go back a screen here for a second. This was how you enabled iCloud, by tapping or dragging on the check mark. And if you didn't want iCloud, you just swiped the card out of the way. But then we thought all the other screens had done a great job of explaining things. What do you mean there are users who don't know how to use this app? Well, we just hadn't counted on people just swiping straight through them, which is stupid because I've done that plenty of times in the past. But looking back at this failure made me go away and think, what's the best way to introduce a user to your app? And this is something that I've tried to consider pretty carefully. Looking at quite a few apps, here are a couple of existing examples. So, no welcome, no tutorial. Here's two apps that don't have a welcome screen or tutorial at all. Of course, Music, which is a stock app, and Filibaba's Egg Timer is here again. But taking a look at Music, it's using a native UI. It's pretty obvious how you use it. The icons really mean something, and you see all the relevant information that you may need about what's playing. And there's nothing hidden that will surprise you. And it's exactly how iOS was designed. You don't need to read a user manual or complicated instructions. You can just pick it up and play. And for the Egg Timer, our custom interface example, the same goes. It relies on the realism of the iconic timer that it's based off. You just swipe your finger to the left to set the time, and there's no tutorial to teach you how to do that. It's just so simple. And it helps reiterate the fact that users shouldn't have to think about how to use your app. But I think it goes without saying, if you design an app like Paper or Clear and you don't have a welcome guide, users just aren't going to have a clue on how to use it. So you've designed an app that's like that, which is a little bit more custom. You've got something that you want to show off, maybe a nice gesture or two. And this is where you would use welcome cards. And these are an okay solution. As previously mentioned, people might just skip straight through them and not really read them, either by swiping or tapping next. They're forced in up front, and they're separated from the app's experience. But tutorials are something that can be extremely valuable. It makes things discoverable, some of which may only be found by chance if there wasn't a tutorial. Carousel by Dropbox is a little bit different from some of the other apps that use welcome cards. The content moves as you scroll vertically, and then you tap the highlighted bubble to move on, whilst readability is a little bit more traditional. You just swipe between the cards. But both these apps show off really nice animations. The content that you see, such as the photos and the little kind of document icons, they follow you all the way from start to the finish. But there's another problem with this type of walkthrough. You'll be overloading your user with a bunch of things to remember and teaching them to interact with things that they haven't even seen yet. But don't expect your user to remember how to interact with something a couple of hours or days after they've first read this tutorial. In customizable content, it's not exactly a tutorial method, but something that users can come across uniquely or see paired alongside a tutorial. And this isn't something that would necessarily teach a user how to use your app. Facebook Paper and Beats Music, which seems to be Apple's new app, the examples here tell people how to interact with these screens to allow them to customize what they see, a small setup screen, if you will. But including this as part of an app's first run experience really lets the user be in control, and it makes sure that they don't end up seeing things that they don't want. And you can experiment with ideas here as well. Either of these apps could have just used boring lists with checkboxes, but they've put a lot of thought into how users should interact with these screens. And last of all, guided walkthroughs. And I found these to be probably one of the best ways to teach a user how to use your app. Facebook Paper is in both screenshots here, and I have to say, I think it's been done brilliantly. The idea of a guided walkthrough isn't anything that's new. It's an idea that's been taken from video games, where you learn how to do by doing. Doing the action that you're being taught reinforces the idea in your head to help you remember. And in Paper, these little notes appear on the top and bottom of the screen when you're in a certain section, and you also get an animated cursor showing you what to swipe and what direction to swipe in. And I was delighted when I found that these notes were actually being read to me. It was a really nice touch, and it definitely felt like there was an almost human connection with the app. But if you don't care, or you've already seen this before, you've reinstalled the app, you've got an option to dismiss these tutorials. Now, I'm not saying that you should all go out and copy Paper's first run, but if you've used it, you can really appreciate the thought and consideration that Facebook have put into teaching people how to use their app, especially considering how custom it is. Now, those were just a couple of possibilities you can go for when introducing a new user to your app. And there are different options, but these are the key things to remember. First impressions are important. Now, I guess this is because I've probably become quite cynical, but I can usually tell whether I'm going to like an app or not within the first minute or so in using it. If I can tell that a developer or a company has put a lot of care and attention into their welcome and how they introduce new users to their app, they'll have put that same amount of care and attention elsewhere. Engage with your user. Your user will be interacting with the screen you've presented to them, but you need to make sure you can break down the barrier to engage with them and try and use the appropriate language, delight them, and try and make their experience more personal. Use your user's name if you've already requested it, for example. Don't overload users with information, which is a problem that's presented with welcome cards, but can easily appear with other tutorial methods. If you have a really long explanation on how to use a feature or a complete walkthrough of an app, this is likely to be too much at once, and users may struggle to remember the important points if you provide too much cruft. And users like discovering things. As long as you have something which isn't too integral, you don't need to explain it. And these things could be shortcuts or Easter eggs, just general niceties in the app that can add unique little touches. And when a user discovers them, it can really put a smile on their face. Now, as I'm coming up to the end of my slot, I'm just going to briefly run through some general points that I can hope can be applied to all of the topics that we've looked at. So it's important to give your app a personality. As previously mentioned, it could be the very single reason that a user would choose to use one app over another, just because it's fun or because it can help make complex or tedious tasks easier and better for the user. And it's these users that you've always got to have in mind for every decision that you make. Is it right for the user? Will something be better for them? Even ask yourself the question, would my parents know how to use this app? You have to be quite selfless at times, making sure that something is right for other people and not just for yourself. And your app has to feel like it belongs on iOS. If it doesn't, it can intimidate users, and they may not be sure how to use it if it's so unlike any other app that they own. And Apple's human interface guidelines can really help here if you're unsure about what may be right or wrong. It's an invaluable resource, but remember, they aren't rules, just guidelines. And polish, polish, polish. Give your app the care and attention that it deserves. And work with the designer if you need to come up with some great icons for your app. Maybe even copywriters too for text. And even look out for all the little things, such as making sure that there are always some placeholder images or text on any empty views that your user may come across. And last but not least, don't be gratuitous. I've mentioned it before, but it's worth mentioning again. And this can go to all the things I've covered this morning, such as visuals, gestures, and animations. And I've heard from someone that it's always great to finish off a talk with a quote. So here's mine. If in doubt, leave it out. This came up earlier in the morning, but it's absolutely critical if you're wanting to make a great iOS app. If you're not sure about including something, whether that be a feature, artwork, UI, gestures, animations, don't include it. It's best to be safe than sorry. And that's everything. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed it.